Heidegger's book, The History of the Concept of Time. Chapter 3 is the early development of phenomenological research and the necessity of a radical reflection in and from itself. So we'll skip most of that and we'll go up here to where I landed on page 108. Actually, that background is important. So where I opened up to is this little thing. I'll just read it to you because it's hard for you to squint. Exposition of the neglect of the question of being, of the intentional, as the basic field of phenomenological research. So to understand this question in regard to storytelling is what I want to do. So let's just say that there's two kinds of storytelling, among others: the phenomenological storytelling and the existential storytelling. And what Heidegger is claiming here, and I'm applying it to storytelling and storytelling research that's phenomenological, is they really missed the existential aspects of it. So a quick claim here. You see a lot of research in storytelling that will classify different types of stories, right? And they'll go into an organization and say, well, we found 10 different types of stories. These stories are more prominent, more, et cetera. But the question is, when you've developed these categories of, you're not really dealing with the space-time of storytelling. You're not dealing with the experience of storytelling. You're dealing with some sort of classification schema, some theoretical notion of storytelling, and not storytelling itself. And that's sort of what Heidegger finds problematic about his mentor, Husserl. As you know, Heidegger studied phenomenology with Husserl and then broke away. Husserl's project, in brief, was to create a pure consciousness of the phenomenological region. In order to create pure consciousness, Heidegger wanted to have, hi, Jerry, were you just giving us the finger? Because that's what I saw there. Never mind. That didn't go on the main screen anyway, so we won't worry about that. But that was definitely existential and space-time, as opposed to phenomenological. Now, what Edmund Husserl was doing is he wanted to study pure consciousness. And to do that, he wanted to bracket out other forms of inputs and manifestations. And essentially what Heidegger says is he kind of throws the baby out with the bath. He throws out the existential when he does his bracketing. And he only mentions space-time once during the section that I'm looking at, the spatio-temporal. And if you know Heidegger's greater project, it is that being is an occurrence within time and within space, and our freedom to maneuver within the acts therein in space and time. So that when we categorize stories and say there's story type A, B, C, and D, stories of the hero, stories of the little person, stories of being fired or whatever, we are not dealing anymore with the individuation of stories, like an individual's experience in space-time. We've kind of reduced this. So this active reduction is what he's talking about. So Heidegger says of Husserl was taking being as immanent being, and being as being a givenness. Being is givenness to us. Being is an absolute constitutiveness. And a lot of my stuff on anti-narrative falls into that third area, the constitutiveness required for narrative and story. And then the fourth one, which Heidegger seems to prefer, is individuation, where each individual, for example, has their living story in space-time and being in the world. And so I'm not going to get into details on too much of that. So let's just take a few ganders here at the chapter itself. So he wants to explain why this is a very, very important question, this critique of the methodological aspect of phenomenological reduction. It seems to arrive at the pure consciousness starting from the factual real consciousness giving to the natural attitude. Okay, so if you look at psychological research, David Trofimo and Sabine and I with Grace Ann, we have a lot of dinners. We're looking forward to a new dinner. And attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs, is all about what the psychologists look at. For Heidegger, this isn't enough to say that you have an attitude of this kind in a storytelling, for example, or you have a certain belief manifest in a story, etc. And what Heidegger says is that is a way of withdrawing from really what is the factual human being. But if we just take the factual human being, we're not really focused on the human being's experience of the world itself. So we want to know that experience of the world in space and time, just to stay there. And if we focus on a real consciousness of their story. So let's say we each have a story that we're living out in our individuation in the different countries and states that we're in, then we have a being of consciousness. We have some consciousness of that story, but the consciousness of our story and the beingness of our actions in the world of space-time are not the same thing. The second direction that Heidegger takes is the whole field of intentionality, which to me is very, very important because I want to look at bets on the future. I want to look at forecasting and things of that sort. As he unfolds this section of the book and does his critique of phenomenological reduction and the relevance to storytelling, a lot of storytelling is just about two areas. The past, right? So we say the past has happened and we've had the experience of the past and that's the story that's real and there we are. However, there's the story of the now. We're in the now, we're experiencing the space-time in the now is opening up and we have that freedom of maneuver in the now. However, there is an intentional basis of where today I prepared somewhat for the presentation. So I had an intention of bringing about this presentation and an intention to make a few points here and there. I'm betting I can do it and accomplish it without doing a phenomenological reduction, So that's what I'm trying to do. So one of the things that Heidegger brings to the table is he wants to get away from just the theoretical and ideation of a story. So if we take, here's where it gets kind of complex. If it wasn't complex already, now it gets really complex. So if we take Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare, does that story exist? Is that a real story? Is that a true story? Is it a story that's an ideal Shakespearean? Well, if you know about the way Shakespeare put together the theatrical performance of Shakespeare, that a lot of it wasn't even written down, and a lot of the actors would improvise and Shakespeare would improvise, and it would depend on the audience. It would change over time, and it's only in the recent 100, 200, 500 years that Romeo and Juliet was put into, raw text and had to be done according to the textual play. But the point is, the ideal of Romeo and Juliet, I went there to Italy where Romeo and Juliet, the two families, so a bit of folklore existed of Romeo and Juliet before Shakespeare actually wrote it down, I think, is my understanding. And then Shakespeare takes a very popular story and puts it into theater. It comes into a sense of existence in the performance, the act. Now, was that the way in which those two families actually behaved and had their vendetta against each other and the two lovebirds ended up dead? I'm not sure that I could agree to that. A little bit about intentionality. If the intentional is to be interrogated regarding the manner of being, then the entity which is intentional must be originally given. That is, it must be originally experienced in the manner of being. Now, what the hell does that mean? Okay, so let's look at true storytelling. If we take principle 4, which is being, and principle 3, which is the plots or bets on the future, as I call them. Now that you have an intention of something, let's say in organizations where you're going to bet on producing an encyclopedia of business storytelling. Let's say we're all involved in that, or many of us here are involved in that, and we're producing this volume of business storytelling. So it's beginning to be experienced in the manner of being. But initially, it's intentional because nothing was written. I remember Usha Haley got a hold of me. I'm sorry she's not here today, but she got a hold of me and said, can you do 14 volumes of the encyclopedia about business storytelling and be the editor-in-chief? And I said, sure, why not? I'll get a hold of my friend Duncan. I'll get a hold of my friend David. I'll get a hold of Ronnie. Betty write something. We'll have Curly Sand write something. And then COVID hit. And the reality of the space-time of COVID meant that the intentional that I'm interrogating in the manner of being of the encyclopedia, that entity was intentional as originally given. But one volume dropped out. We had an indigenous ways of knowing volume that didn't come to fruition. Most of the other volumes did happen. Yay. But they didn't happen all at once. So the 14 volumes, if I got the count right, there's about 5 that are ready to be published, and there's 4 or 5 more coming out in the next wave, and another 4 or 5 in the last wave are yet to be done. So this notion of the intentional that's experienced, and this exemplar I'm using of the Encyclopedia of Business Storytelling, we looked at race, we looked at gender, we looked at entrepreneurship, we looked at empirical methodology, we looked at a whole number of things, a whole number of topic areas. So those are kind of the theoretical lens in the topic itself. And then authors went out to develop real occurrences of these phenomena in their theme and formed the region of business storytelling. Now, business storytelling already existed as a genre. However, the way we put it together was quite different than what was there. In fact, it is so different that it has no classification. There's no classification for this, which means it won't be understood for many, many years after I'm gone, after maybe all of us are gone. So we have the intentional constitution, the constituting of a business storytelling encyclopedia, and we have empirical unities, the editors writing, authors writing, egos involved in a good way, right? So there's a certain empirical unity to a volume. It has paper, it's produced, it has textual material, it's distributed by publishers at conferences, and it enters here on page 112, what Heidegger calls the whole spatial temporal world. It enters that world. So I'm kind of complexifying it a little bit because I'm interested in the individualized lived stories of human beings or animals or environment or vibrant matter, whatever you're looking at, whatever phenomenon you're doing, as reaching some region of consciousness, right? So we hope to reach the region of consciousness of the business executive and the business workers and the technicians and the people that own McDonald's franchises and whatever. We want to raise consciousness so that consciousness that we're raising is completely different than the encyclopedia entering its space-time. And I remember Jerry showing me what happens when we remove a layer of imitation of a mimeograph and we get to the more of the original woodcut of the item. So I know something about the printing industry and how that happens and the whole editing process and publishing process and the difficulty of that. I think has its own reality of acts, as does the ways of experiencing space-time of the world itself in the world of business. And I don't know if you've noticed much about business, but it's really hard to be ethical in business. It's really hard to be ethical. Yet it's portrayed as this ethical practice. It's really hard not to be stereotyping women and natives and blacks and whites and greens and reds and whatever blues and whatever colors you're going to look at. The experience of business storytelling can be exceedingly oppressive. And I suppose that's the angle in which the Encyclopedia of Business Storytelling kind of uncovers something, brings forth a neglected aspect of the existential. So I'm not looking here at the attitude of business or the personality of the CEO or the founder's story. I guess I'm more interested, going back to the 2000 book, none of the people in this viewing audience will ever be in a history book. I will never be in a history book. You will never, but we will all be in this encyclopedia. That'll be interesting. But we will never, all the dodos that were CEOs, like Ray Kroc at McDonald's, he's going to be forever in the history books. And I will challenge whether or not the questioning of that is whether we're really getting to the business storytelling. So the intentionality I had for this business storytelling was to move out of the phenomenological. Okay, so I mean, like counting the types of stories, looking at the personality. Some of you may know from folklore, Stith Thompson, the myth themes. So we look at the myth themes, every kind of story that had a witch in it, every kind of story that had a burning candle in it. Right? Every kind of story had a broomstick in it. So those are myth themes, right? Well, myth themes are not, I don't think, existential. They are floating categories, but don't get into the space-time in the radical sense that I'm looking at it. So let's just back up and look at what we've done so far. We're trying to say that Heidegger didn't like to be confined by Husserl's pursuit of the pure consciousness, because the pure consciousness omitted space, time, and matter. He doesn't mention matter in this section, but let's just say space, time, mattering in the Baradian sense, right? And that by omitting that and doing the grounded theory work of breaking things into categories and counting thematics and doing all that empiricism, we've erased and reduced and no longer have access to the existential aspects of the storytelling itself. So that's the problem with the phenomenological. So let's just see if there's anything else we can bring in. And particularly in psychology, Husserl in particular, as Heidegger says, it's already necessary in its initial breakthrough, in as much as phenomenology was elaborated from a particular psychology. This demarcation must obviously deal with the being of acts. So again, if we look at Sabine's former tapings, the being of acts is that element of freedom that individuals have in pursuing their own authentic being in space, time, matter. That would be the definition of existential. Not that it's the only definition. Jean-Paul Sartre had another definition, and many others would have other definitions, but that seems to be the direction that Heidegger is going. So I'll end it there.